Sounds like what they're trying to figure out is like what counts as an officially casted vote, right? Because the argument that the plaintiff is making here is that once you've handed your ballot and it's been postmarked so that the post office has received the ballot, that should be counted as an officially counted vote. So even if it's opened after Election Day, it should still be counted. And it sounds like what the justices are pushing on is, okay, well, what counts as an officially finished vote? Like, what does that mean? Which is a valid question, right? Oh, boy.
Everyone voted in person.
We're challenging mail-in ballots? Like all of them?
There was no secret ballot. Voters challenged each other's qualifications at the polls on Election Day, and states received ballots on Election Day. Over time, states changed all those practices. They did so as Congress extended Election Day to all federal offices. They've done so ever since. No one claims that in setting the federal election day, Congress blocked most of those changes. The dispute is whether Congress blocked just one change, allowing ballots cast by Election Day to be received after that day. States have allowed that for over a century. Congress has respected it. No one challenged it until now. The question is whether Congress in 1845 blocked that practice. The answer is no. The Election Day statutes adopt a simple rule. States must make a final choice of officers by Election Day. That is the plain meaning of an election. As this court said in United States versus Classic, from time immemorial, an election to public office has been in point of substance no more and no less than the expression by qualified electors of their choice of candidates. Mississippi satisfies that rule. It makes a choice on Election Day. And only that rule respects the last 180 years of state lawmaking. If Election Day must be what it was in 1845, that takes out much more than the ballot receipt laws of 30 states today. It dooms absentee voting, modern methods of voting, the secret ballot, and more. Congress did not adopt that destabilizing view when it simply set the Election Day. The Fifth Circuit was wrong to rule otherwise. This court should reverse. I welcome the court's questions.
The Fifth Circuit.
Just to be clear, you said in your opening statement, sometimes you said the choice has to be made by Election Day, and at other points you say on Election Day. Which is it?
I think the statewide choice needs to be made by or on Election Day itself when the entire electorate has voted, Justice Thomas. I think voters themselves need to make their individual selections by Election Day.
If I give my mail-in ballot to my neighbor, is that a choice?
It's a choice. It's not a final choice that can be recognized in the context of an election.
So when do I know whether or not a choice is final?
When you've submitted to the state, to the appropriate state election official through the designated state process.
So why isn't it the rule then that the final or the formalized decision, electoral decision, isn't made until that's done?
Until it's submitted to the official, Your Honor. I think the choice is made once the voters as a whole have made an irrevocable decision by casting their ballots. A final choice. They've
well,
cast
if
their
I
ballots.
made a final choice when I handed it to my neighbor.
But it's a final choice within an official state process, Justice Thomas.
Well, I think the ballot is an official state process. Is that enough?
Not enough to be known in a public way to the state. That happens when it's
counted, right?
Parted with and submitted through mail to the appropriate election official. Then it's final.
If day includes a period after a particular day of the election, does it include a particular day before the day of the election? Or does your logic require a different consideration?
Forgive me if I may not be understanding the question correctly, Your Honor, but I think the key is that the election day is the day by which a final choice electorate-wide must be made. It can't be made after that day by voters or the electorate as a whole, but individual selections can surely be made before that day because there's still no final choice until you have an electorate-wide deadline.
Is there any limit to that?
As to how early people could vote?
Sure. They fill out a ballot if you're giving them a ballot and, drop it off 2 weeks before.
As far as the federal election day statutes are concerned, Your Honor, I don't think there is a limit to how early that could occur. I think you just need the day when the electorate as a whole needs to have chosen. There might be other practical or other barriers in that. Of course, elections are a very long process to begin with, the entire electoral process, so surely things are happening weeks and months before. But I think even a couple weeks before, even earlier than that in some cases, people are making individual selections. It's just election day itself is the day for the final collective choice.
Counsel, I want to go back to your answers to Justice Thomas. So I understand that Mississippi's particular rule says that it has to be deposited in USPS or with a common carrier, but I don't understand why Mississippi's definition in the next case would preclude a state from adopting a law along the lines of the one that Justice Thomas is proposing. For example, if I have someone in my neighborhood, in my HOA, who says, listen, I'm going to take everybody's votes in, what if the state said, that's fine, if you've cast your final vote, and you've designated someone to carry your vote as long as it gets to the ballot box 5 days after Election Day, it's fine. Why does your definition preclude what Justice Thomas hypothesized?
Right, and I think, Justice Barrett, the answer is that submission to mail or common carrier is different in kind than, say, submitting it to a relative or sort of a neighbor.
What's the difference? They're not government officials.
They are impartial third parties that have a duty to deliver what they're owed without altering it.
But what about the definition that you're proposing precludes that? Your definition didn't say final as submitted to an impartial.
These aren't the full oral arguments. I didn't hear the opening, but I don't know. I don't even know what this case is about 100%. Who brought this case to get rid of post-dated mail-in ballots? And what's the case name? Who versus who? Watson versus Republican National Committee. The RNC's challenge to Mississippi law allowing mail-in ballots to be counted within 5 days of Election Day. Okay, gotcha.
Partial third party or final as submitted to a common carrier. You said the final choice has been made. And there are lots of different ways, it seems to me, that you can make a final choice. And you also have the problem of this revocability from the Postal Service, that regulation.
So I think, to start with the first part, Your Honor, I think we're going at a historically recognized form of finality. I think history is helpful in a number of ways. And one way is that as long as we've had mail-in voting, we've for almost as long as that time, we've had post-election day ballot receipt. Mail-in voting, I think, in general, has been understood as a permissible, unchallenged method.
I wouldn't rely on the history if I were you, since you're telling us not to rely on the other side's history. Like, just because it's always been done that way doesn't mean it has to be done that way, which I actually find is a good point in your favor. But then it seems to me that you're flipping back around and saying, well, absentee voting has always been done that way by common carrier, and so that's how we would expect it to be done.
I think
it says something that for 100 years, we've had people voting by mail, and that's been an understood means of submitting a ballot to the state. I think what it embodies, Justice Barrett, is there's an intuition that when you put something through the Postal Service, it's final, it's trusted, it's not like giving it to a kind of a non-official third party.
What if a state came up with a law that said so long as a notary, that's official, that's recognized, certified that you cast your ballot on Election Day and it was delivered later by whatever means, common carrier or not? What in your theory of the preemptive effect of this statute would preclude that law?
I think 2 points on that, Justice Gorsuch. One, I think, is that...
Pick your best.
Well, I think one's kind of a point in our favor and one's kind of a point against our friends.
How many people are in these hearings? That sounded like 20 people laughing.
There's a finality of submitting it to an official, and...
Yeah, it's been notarized by, well, how about a justice of the United States Supreme Court? Is that official enough for you?
It's pretty official. I don't think it's been...
It's pretty official.
It's pretty good, Your Honor, but I don't think it kind of hits submission to the state.
Okay. Well, I wanted to explore. So that's not submitted to the state, even if it's notarized, an affidavit is final on the day of, and somebody brings it into the state offices a week or 3 months later. That doesn't count. But if it goes into the mail, it does. What in the statute? What words in the statute would you have us read that rule into?
Well, I think. Just to make sure I understand, I think that's fine under my friend's view too, Your Honor. A notary could be...
I'm asking about your view, counsel.
Sure. So I think...
You're saying that's not fine, and I want to understand what in the federal law preempts that.
Well, I think, number one, I just am not, at least as I'm understanding the hypothetical, it doesn't appear to be submission to the state, Your Honor.
It gets submitted to the state 3 weeks later, just not by common carrier.
Well, if what you're saying, Your Honor, is that a notary has been deemed a sufficient ballot receiver under state law, then
yes.
I think...
Then that's okay too. Okay, what if state law? So now you're saying that is okay.
I think it may depend on how, what the level of officiality.
Well, the state says it's official. By God, when a Supreme Court justice or perhaps just a notary says it's official, that's good enough under your. It has to be, I think. And if that's okay, why can't a state say, how about a timestamp video showing that I voted on Election Day? Here I am filling out my ballot, and then my brother or maybe some aggregator of ballots brings it in a week or 3 later. And that's got to be okay too, doesn't it?
I think it's still just, I keep coming back, Justice Gorsuch, to this pedigree of submitting it to a state. I think as a good example.
Well, the state says that's official. State says that's fine. Ballot aggregators are great. And so long as it's a timestamp video or a notary or maybe a Supreme Court or who knows what, the librarian says you cast it on the day of the election, we're good to go, right?
I do still have some concern that it has not been submitted.
Counsel, why are you fighting the premise? In the Civil War, at least 2 states permitted military officers who weren't sworn state officials. They were federal officials, but not sworn state officials to accept the ballots and transmit it by mail to the state, okay? And that was in the Civil War, all right? Since 1918, we've had laws like Mississippi. By 1944, 8 of them. Since then, 12 more by 1886. And now half the states permit absentee ballots that are dropped in the mail, correct? No different than in the Civil War. We have no federal law that says that's not okay, for the state to designate someone by whom an official ballot has to be given by Election Day, correct? And if the state wants to make it a notary republic, if it wants to make it a military officer, if it wants to make it a Supreme Court justice, if it wants to make it anyone, as long as it's done by Election Day, that's what counts, correct?
I mean, I think that's possible. We're not quite asking for that, Your Honor. I really don't.
No, you don't, because you're only defending this law, and this law is very consistent with what happened in the Civil War. It's very consistent with what has happened for over 100 years. There's nothing in federal law that has prohibited it explicitly, correct?
That's right, Your Honor.
Well,
right.
Justice Sotomayor is asking you what I think she intends to be a friendly question, but maybe you want to think about whether you want to go that far. What if the state designates...
Who should we be rooting for? I mean, there's literally no reason why, if the ballot is I didn't hear the oral arguments, so I'm trying to like divine them or with the opening statement. But it sounds like what they're trying to figure out is like what counts as an officially casted vote, right? Because the argument that the plaintiffs are making here, I believe, because they're the one that brought the case, the argument that the plaintiff is making here is that once you've handed your ballot and it's been postmarked, so that the post office has received the ballot, that should be counted as an officially counted vote. So even if it's opened after Election Day, it should still be counted. And it sounds like what the justices are pushing on is, okay, well, what counts as an officially finished vote? Like, what does that mean? Which is a valid question, right? Let's say, for instance, let's say that I give my ballot to a family member, like 3 days before the election, and they say that they've received it. Can that count as an officially handed off vote? Or what if I hand it to a judge, like a Supreme Court justice? Or what if I hand it to, any person that could be designated by the state? And it sounds like the plaintiff sounds like he doesn't really have a great response to that. I feel like the response should just be, as long as it's a state-recognized process, then any of these things could count. But Sotomayor, the reason why Sotomayor pushed him here is because I think she's asking, like, why won't you just accept that, like, this could be acceptable? Or, like, what? Because he needs to define something here, I think. But the frustration that I would have here is, and I'm sure it'll come up when the justices ask questions on the other side, is we need to have a really, 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 really good reason not to we need to have a good reason to disenfranchise a voter, to take away their vote. There needs to be some very compelling argument there. And so if you've mailed in a ballot and there was a tornado or some huge backup or something happened and it couldn't be counted until after Election Day, you're basically saying that this person's vote has been invalidated. And we need to have like a really, really, really good reason, I think, to invalidate that vote. But then it's also legitimate to ask, well, what kind of votes could we cast past the ballot day? What if somebody videotaped themselves giving a sealed ballot to a person, and then that person, had 1,000 sealed ballots that people videotaped themselves giving, and then this person, for whatever reason, like now this person could be FedEx or UPS, they weren't able to drop those votes off until, 5 days after Election Day. Should those be counted because they were handed off? It's not the voter's fault, right? Yeah. But the burden is on the plaintiff here to make that argument.
An official of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party who receives these ballots, collects ballots, and fills out an affidavit saying, I received all these and I will faithfully deliver them. Would that be okay?
Well, I think it's actually okay under my friend's view, Your Honor. We're not making that ask. I mean, as far as my friend's view are concerned, so long as somebody's designated a ballot receiver, they can be fine. Party boss, party bagman, relative, any of those, so long as the state says you are a ballot receiver, that's fine. The only thing that apparently is not fine is U.S. Postal Service common carrier. And I think that is, a very odd way to read those statutes.
Well, the Postal Service is not part of the state, and the common carrier isn't part of any government.
That's right, Your Honor. But I mean, certainly, we all know the status of the U.S. Postal Service as a highly regulated government entity with certain obligations. Common carriers, in a very similar way, highly regulated with similar obligations. And they give, in both cases, they're imbued with a duty.
Why couldn't the state just say the post office can legally collect votes? So it's legally the same as submitting into the machine, then that can count as whenever, right? I don't know. I think that's kind of what they're arguing about. But I don't know what the restrictions on that would be or whatever.
to deliver what they received. And in fact, a duty that's, I think, maybe a good example is the fact that the IRS accepts tax returns, which are obviously highly consequential documents with key timeliness requirements. The IRS accepts tax returns both through the mail and through common carriers.
Well, you will accept ballots that are received within 5 days after Election Day. That the date that's set as Election Day, right?
That's right.
And you have a variety of line drawing problems. So we've been exploring one. To whom and by what means is the ballot to be delivered to the state? But what about the length of time that a state could choose? Isn't it the case that some state allows, will count ballots that are received 21 days after Election Day?
There are a couple that at the outlier it's kind of canvassing and it can go that far. I think more common.
Is that okay? Is that all right?
As far as the federal,
my very broad, constitutional takeaway from this, although I guess it would come down to how things are challenged later in courts if people feel disenfranchised, is that the state has the right to determine how they want to do this. At the end of the day, the only thing the state owes the federal government is their elector slates. Like, who is your state voting for? Now, how a state decides to accept ballots or whatever the fuck else, I feel like it's up to the state to figure out, up to the elector votes. They can do whatever the fuck they want.
Election day statutes are concerned, yes, Your Honor. And I think this actually gets to a good point that loops back to something Justice Gorsuch was getting at in a certain way, which I think he was saying, what in the federal election day statutes decides that? I think that's the key point in our favor. This is an area where states get to go first, make these decisions. Congress can step in, but the idea.
So there's no limit, except I suppose the day when the presidential electors have to be appointed, or the day when the next Congress starts its session. That's the only limit on counting mail-in ballots.
Those are some of the limits, Your Honor. But I'd also say that the federal election day statutes don't require states to count ballots at all. It doesn't speak to counting, period. So, I mean, if a state really didn't want
not counting, but being delivered. So I do think it is a consequence, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but just so we can wrap this up, that by any means and by any date up until the next Congress meets, a state can receive ballots.
I think for congressional races, potentially, yes, Your Honor. I think there are other Title III kind of things that push action earlier in the presidential context. But again, I mean, there's nothing. The key question is these are three one-sentence provisions, and we want to be, I think, very careful not to read them for more than they're worth.
And counsel, I was just going to say, isn't your point that the line drawing issues that have been raised are only problems to the extent that Congress thought they were problems? We're in a preemption dynamic, and so the question, I think, really is what did Congress intend with its statement about Election Day? Did it mean to cabin the states so that they did not have the discretion to make these kinds of decisions? And in addition to what Justice Sotomayor has said, which is we have no federal statute that precludes this, I think we have several federal statutes that suggest that Congress was aware of post-Election Day ballot deadlines that the states had enacted and, in fact, incorporated those in several circumstances. So can you speak to that? I'm talking about UOCAVA, for example, and some other federal statutes that indicate that Congress not only knew this was going on, but then it interpreted and incorporated the state's own post-election day ballot deadlines into federal law.
Sure, Your Honor. So I think that's exactly right. So UOCAVA is maybe the best example where Congress was told that about a dozen or so states have post-election day ballot receipt laws. It respected those explicitly as to a deadline for ballots in that law. I think the United States has agreed with us on that.
And Congress wasn't worried, I think, about the states picking dates that were, we might think are too long or whatnot. That was not in the statute. Congress just said whatever the state has decided with regard to ballot receipt deadlines is going to apply here, correct? And
that's been the case for 180 years, Your Honor. And I think one feature that obviously we're searching for what do the statutes mean at the time, but I think it's very hard for my friends to explain the past 100 years of history and this lawmaking. The Soldier Voting Act in the 1940s was another example where Congress recognized and respected state deadlines, and it gets very hard to explain those things if you don't adopt the view that the federal election day statutes just do not set a ballot receipt deadline.
Well, I want to ask you about the recall problem. And before I get to that, throughout your brief, you say that the federal statute does require voters to submit their ballots to election officials on Election Day, must be cast by Election Day, and that the Election Day is the day to conclude and consummate the election through a final selection. You agree with all those statements in your brief?
Yes.
Okay. But at the same time, you say, actually, it doesn't have to be submitted to an election official. It just has to be submitted to a common carrier. And there's a contradiction there that I just want you to first address, and then I'll give you my hypothetical.
Very good, Your Honor. I think when you put something in the mail,
that's not an election official. FedEx isn't an election official.
Right, but the recipient certainly is the person who you're submitting in the mail to. I mean, that is the recipient.
Of course.
And right, Your Honor. And I think
you submit it to FedEx and they deliver it to the election official. But you say it has to be submitted to an election official throughout your brief, but then you say a common carrier is okay. And those two things don't add up.
Well, I think the difference is, say, sending it to your brother versus sending it to the registrar.
Well, we already dealt with that. The brother turns out to be okay, so long as the state says so.
I think that's okay on their view, Your Honor. I'm a little more guarded on that.
I think you already answered that one. So here's the hypo. Let's say you have a state where a large portion of the electorate mails in their ballots on or close to Election Day. Not far-fetched. Many states are like that. Then, the day after the election, a story breaks that one of the lead candidates engaged in an inappropriate sexual escapade, or perhaps is concluding with a foreign power. Again, not far-fetched, I think.
Concluding or colluding? Misspeak.
And the competing candidate immediately goes on the airwaves and urges voters to recall their ballots and to tell the common carriers not to deliver them. And many common carriers will do that with anything that you send through them. FedEx, you just call them up and say, I want it back. In that hypothetical, did the election happen on Election Day? Oh, by the way, it swings the election.
So the election did happen on Election Day, Justice Gorsuch. As we've explained, our ballot does not allow using mail recall, anything like that. When somebody submits their ballot by mail.
Just first deal with my hypothetical, and then I'll deal with your statute.
Okay, the election happened on Election Day.
Even though it changes the outcome.
I don't know if this is true or not. I don't know if it's true at all. Somebody could me. My understanding is, I don't even know why I have this. I'm just being honest. I thought I read this somewhere. Is that if you mail in a vote, that if you vote in person, that can overrule that. So like if I mail in a ballot and I actually change my mind, I'm like, actually, you know what? This guy, he had a son on his stream. I don't want to vote for him. That I can go to the polling booth in person and I can vote, and whatever my vote is in person would override the mail-in ballot vote. Is that true for every state, or is that true for any of them, or is that, like I read this before?
I mean, I think...
Yes, has to be your answer, doesn't
it? I mean, yes, Your Honor. I want to be clear about the...
All right.
We are not agreeing that the outcome can be properly changed in that circumstance.
Well, hold on. It did in my hypothetical. You can't change my hypothetical, counsel.
And I'm just saying it's unlawful, Your Honor. I don't mean to disparage your hypothetical. I'm just saying that it's an unlawful circumstance because we don't allow ballot.
Oh, in Mississippi. Okay, but that hypothetical could happen in another state, right?
I think if the state is not providing that on mailing there's a final choice made, I think that would be a problem with that law under the federal statute.
Now, you say your statute, you're different. You admit my hypothetical could happen, but you say it can't happen in Mississippi.
Has this guy done Supreme Court cases before? I don't like this. I don't like the plaintiff arguing here. This lawyer doesn't. I don't think he's doing a great job. Which is kind of spooky, but...
Because recall's not allowed. I couldn't find that anywhere in Mississippi law. In fact, what I did see was a statute that says that you...
This lawyer argued and won Dobbs. Okay.
That the Secretary of State can promulgate rules and regulations. That's 23-15-637-3. And then I went and looked at the regulations. And Rule 2.1 says that an absentee ballot is the final vote of a voter when the ballot is marked accepted. That doesn't preclude recall. In fact, that allows recall.
I respectfully don't agree with that, Your Honor. I mean,
where does it say recall's not permitted? I couldn't find that anywhere in your statutes or the rule.
And I think by providing that ballots are final when cast under our statute.
No, it doesn't. It says they're final when marked accepted.
That's the regulation, Your Honor.
Yeah. It's your regulation. And it allows recall.
Respectfully, it does not allow recall, Your Honor.
Show me where. Would you read to me the provision that precludes it?
It's subsection 3 of the statute that my friends have challenged.
I read you said subsection 3 that says the Secretary of State can make rules, and then I read you the rule.
To ensure that the ballots are final when cast. The key thing is ballots are final when cast.
It says no votes promulgated by an absentee ballot, that the person's absentee vote is final. You can make rules about when they're final, and what the rule says is it's final when marked accepted.
And that's, I mean, it's speaking to a processing rule about what to do when somebody's ballot potentially doesn't arrive on time. They submit an affidavit ballot. But I would come back to the text of the statute, Your Honor. I mean, final when cast is what our law.
Mr. Stewart, I just want to ask a clarifying point to this. Is it possible for a portion of Mississippi's statute to be unlawful, not just go with me here, a portion of Mississippi's statute to be unlawful insofar as it potentially permits recall, but still that, would not address whether Mississippi's statute was unlawful insofar as it allowed ballot receipt after Election Day?
Yes, Your Honor. I mean, I think one possibility would be like, hey, look, you need a more unambiguous finality here, and you need a foreclosed recall period, full stop.
Okay. And on this question, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. When you said, yes, my friends on the other side say it's okay for private parties to deliver just like you do, are you saying that that's just a manner of receipt? And whether the ballot is received before or after the election, on all sides, everybody agrees that absentee ballots can be turned in by having, the neighbor, the party operative, or whatever, scoop them up and bring them to the ballot box?
Your Honor, I mean, maybe, I'm not sure if I answered the earlier thing as crisply as I could. I'm not comfortable with the neighbor piece. I do have serious concerns about that.
But is that tied to the ballot receipt problem, or is that just tied to, hey, maybe this is an unlawful way of executing absentee balloting, regardless of when the ballots make it to the official?
I think it's the finality of the choice that has to be done by Election Day. And
Okay.
my concern is that if you're not sending it by mail or common carrier,
You're getting caught up, counsel, again. Could you go back to the question? Justice Barrett is not arguing with you.
fair, Your
What
Honor.
she's saying, and what you said earlier is, and you believe that under your adversary, the opposing counsel's theory, you can give it to the RNC operative. You can give it to anybody, and so long as it's received on Election Day by the state, that's okay. That's what you're saying, your opposing counsel saying. And you're saying the only question before us is if they can designate an appropriate vehicle to transmit the votes, then that's okay.
Who joined? Oh, Moody, not saying anything. Okay. Are we serious right now, bro?
I think I was saying the latter part, yes, Your Honor. But I actually think, under my friend's view, it's okay for, like, a state can deem the ballot deemed received when the party operative himself or herself receives it, because all that person has to do is be a ballot receiver designated by the state.
Right.
And we're trying to hew more closely not just to the text, but also the historical 100-year-long, you can submit it by mail.
Okay. So, but the bottom line is that states can choose when the final vote has to be counted.
States have discretion over counting.
Exactly.
Thank you, counsel. Justice Thomas, anything further?
Just as a point of clarification, without looking at the subsequent
You got to switch channels. Discord is messed up. What?
history,
Oh,
what do you think
no,
the federal
that's fine.
law
Good luck.
required as far as the election day?
That the voters make a final choice by that day. The way I'd boil it down, Justice Thomas, is choice is critical and unchanging. Method of making that choice is malleable, and that does also explain all the subsequent history.
And you don't have to formalize that choice.
You do by parting with your ballot and submitting it to the state.
Have we had any examples?
Justice Alito?
Your position does require some difficult line drawing problems, and maybe that's inevitable. But one is the degree of confidence that one must have in the entity or person who transmits the ballot to the state. We've talked about that. One is how long after the election day votes can be received. A third is whether it has to be postmarked. Aren't there 8 states that do not require a postmark for late ballots?
There are a number of states that don't require that, Your Honor. I think postmarking is good evidence that something has been timely submitted. That's kind of borne out in the tax context. I think, if somebody were challenging a law like that, it would potentially be a very different kind of a challenge. They'd have to make sort of factual showings to challenge that ballots were not cast by Election Day, but surely not this case.
No, maybe it's inevitable that some sort of line drawing decisions like these have to be made, unless the rule is anything goes. States can do anything they want in this area. We don't have a whole lot to go on here.
Discord confirms major outage. Okay.
We have the phrase election day, and we have history. If we looked just at the phrase election day, what would we take from that? I think you've been saying we're moving in this direction. We don't have election day anymore. We have election month, or we have election months. I mean, the early voting can start a month before the election. The ballots can be received a month after the election.
Well, I think the best way to read it, Your Honor, is that by setting Election Day, the Congress set the final choice day. And that's the key thing, final choice day. What Congress was concerned about at the time was some states making final choices, say, a month before other states were making final choices, and the distortions, the fraud, the risks that had. And when everybody's making a final choice on the same day, even if some individual choices are made before then, you're honoring the statutes. And I think, Justice Alito, you made this observation, not a lot to go on because the statutes are just there's not a lot of prolixity there. I think that's a point in favor of deference to the states. If Congress has not spoken to something, especially in this context where states are expressly empowered to regulate these things, that's a big point in favor of letting states continue to do so as they have for a century.
Do you think it's legitimate for us to take into account Congress's Congress's passage of the Election Day statutes for the purpose of combating fraud or the appearance of fraud? And some of the briefs have argued that confidence in election outcomes can be seriously undermined if the apparent outcome of the election on the day after the polls close is radically flipped by the acceptance later of a big stash of ballots that flip the election, or
I think
bullshit.
You got ballots that are delivered by somebody, by a neighbor, and they're received a month after the election, and they don't have postmarks.
I think the best way to do it is to honor the statutes purpose, but doing so by respecting the statute's text and animating context. And what these statutes were getting at was not just any kind of fraud writ large in all elections, which no statute could do, but a situation where, state 1 votes, has their election on one day, ends it, and state 2, neighboring, has its election 3 weeks later. Because the concern would be, let's say state 1 goes for one party, and then state 3 goes for the other party with a huge turnout for that other party. You could have potential fraud. People went across state lines and voted, or you could have the appearance of that sort of fraud, even if it didn't actually happen. Like people just said, oh my gosh, they voted for that person. Big turnout. So I think that's the kind of thing that animated those statutes, whereas fraud writ large was not a good example. I do think it's notable that my friends with the United States, obviously they've sounded the anti-fraud theme. They haven't cited a single example of fraud from post-election day ballot receipt in this century.
Thank you. I'll let my colleagues say.
Damn.
Justice Sotomayor?
Has there been any history of voter recall in the mails in Mississippi? You say the law doesn't permit it, but has there been any history of it?
None that I've ever heard of, Your Honor. I mean, this isn't something that was raised until the appellate reply briefs, and nobody cited a single example in history of it.
All right. And I understand Justice Alito's questions about the policy questions of what will create discomfort or not. But the Constitution vests the issue of elections in the states unless superseded by Congress, correct?
That's right, Your Honor.
So if there is a policy question to be had, the entities to decide that are the states and Congress, not the courts, correct?
That's right, Your Honor.
And absent a law in federal law that suggests that absentee ballots must be received by a certain time, there's no explicit requirement of that, correct?
Right, Your Honor, or even implicit.
And the implicit, we have the military acts that since World War II at least, and the Civil War, I should go back that far, have permitted absentee ballots to be received long past Election Day, correct?
We have a very long history of that, Your Honor.
Exactly. So the people who should decide this issue are not the courts, but Congress, correct?
Right, Your Honor. I think
the states and Congress.
That's right, Your Honor. And as I was mentioning in my colloquy with, I believe, Justice Alito earlier, I mean, that's kind of the structure of our system. States go first. If Congress doesn't like it, it overrides. And as I think Justice Scalia said for the court in Arizona Intertribal, we respect what Congress said as far as it went, but no farther. And that's kind of the history of voting and election law in the country.
One last question with respect to history. History is informative of what's been permitted by Congress because what we're looking for is what understanding Congress had with respect to elections, correct?
That's right, Your Honor.
All right. And it doesn't talk about the receipt of absentee ballots after elections at all. So we look to the history of whether Congress has accepted it, correct?
I think that does help here, Your Honor.
All right. But the attempt by some of the amici here to brutalize this inquiry and say that history tells us how elections must be held and on what date and when receipt can happen or not happen, why is that not an acceptable way to look at this?
Well, I think the difference between Bruin and here, Your Honor, is that in Bruin, the court, the question at issue, whether a restriction on firearms is consistent with our historical tradition of firearm regulation, there's a rich history addressing precisely that issue, sometimes through analogy, but very much, Bruin itself, I believe, I want to say 40 pages of history just analyzing those things. We don't have anything like that, a rich history suggesting that Congress was even thinking about locking in Election Day ballot receipt or anything like it. It was addressing different things.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mrs. Kagan?
I guess, Mr. Stewart, your answers to Justice Sotomayor's questions leave me unsure about what you think about these appeals to history. You've said that there's not a lot of text here. I agree with that. I think that the way this case has been argued all around suggests that that's so.
Streaming it in Discord.
So then we're
It's not streaming in Discord anymore?
It stopped because you rejoined.
Good.
left with history, or are we left with history? You seem to appeal to history sometimes. Justice Barrett said this, but then repudiate the appeals to history at other times. And I guess I want to know what we're supposed to be doing when we're looking at this statute and deciding this question with respect to all this historical evidence, scant or not scant as it may be.
Sure, Your Honor. So I think the best way I can break it down is this, is that history is informative here. And the way it's most informative is that since Congress set, throughout our history, and certainly since Congress set the federal election day, election administration in our country has been very, very dynamic. As I tried to highlight in my opener, it was one thing in person, on-the-spot qualification checks by fellow voters, ballots were naturally received on election day, all those features. As soon as Congress had a reason to alter the methods by which a choice was made, it did so. But the one constant is that the voters, in a popular government, it's most critically the voters, the constant is that the voters make a final choice of officers by election day. So I think history shows that election administration is dynamic. States have wide leeway. They just have to make sure that the voters make a choice by election day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mrs. Gorsuch?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Almost done, Mr. Stewart. You emphasized to Justice Kagan and many others that the final choice at least has to be done on election day, and so recall would be a problem for you if it could happen. But you say that doesn't happen in Mississippi. That's your position, right?
Right, it's not permitted.
If recall could happen, that would be a problem for your position.
I think there potentially.
Because then it wouldn't be a final decision on Election Day, right?
That's right, Your Honor. I think
Okay.
there'd still be a factual question, though, whether I still have not been cited anything to say that recall is actually a thing that can happen in the world.
I understand, but if it could happen, that would be a problem for your theory because the final choice wouldn't have happened on Election Day, right?
Fair, yep.
Okay. So you say Mississippi prohibits it. We've been through whether that's the case or not.
Very good.
But let's say it did. Let's say there was a law prohibiting recall. How would it ever be enforced? Because how is a state to know? And how is even a common carrier carrying an envelope to know whether that is a ballot that needs to be recalled? And who are you going to prosecute?
Well, I think it could be enforced similar to other voter things. I mean, in our state, there are notarization and affidavit requirements, signing things. I think one of if it were critical for the voter to say that there will be no recall, the voter could say, I hereby commit that I will not attempt to or recall this package in any way, shape, or form. They could just add that, sign it. I take the point about proof problems, but I mean, gosh, Justice Gorsuch, I mean, violating state election laws in a state that really is anti-fraud and really takes wide measures to enforce its laws, I think that would be quite a thing for a voter to do.
Well, in my hypothetical, which you say is unlikely, to swing an election and all of that on recall, but as soon if history teaches anything, scant or not scant, it's that as soon as something's allowed, it will happen eventually, right? And so somebody. That my hypothetical happens and everybody recalls their ballots. I'm just not sure what recourse the state would have against people who violated its anti-recall law.
I mean, if people are, say, recalling things through a common carrier, there's going to be some record that they recalled those things.
How's the state ever going to find out about it?
I mean, I think the same way.
You're going to go prosecute individuals?
I mean, Your Honor, I'd say if somebody is lying in an affidavit that they're not going to recall something, I mean, if people are doing that with impunity, we have quite a problem. But it is a problem that the state can address and enforce.
I just don't know how they'd ever find out about it.
I mean, I think obviously, some crimes are harder to find out and prosecute than others, Your Honor. But I think it's still, I mean, people can do things, try to tamper with ballots, all that sort of thing. I think it's just still a matter of respecting the statute.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justice.
Justice Kavanaugh?
When did Mississippi switch to this method?
2020. 2024 at common carriers.
Is the Mississippi Solicitor General here, is he under oath? I would assume so, right? If you're giving pretty much testimony to the Supreme Court.
I don't know if you're under oath, but you'd be held in contempt of, I don't think this is going to be a thing.
If you're lying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Why? Or yeah, okay.
That makes sense. Well, I'm just curious if they're in here just lying to the Supreme Court, but.
Well, you'd lose your case if they found out you're lying, right?
You'd hope so. Yeah.
It was first because of the pandemic. I don't know that there's necessarily an answerable why as to the 2024 one in a clear way.
And the other side makes a point when we're looking at history, to the extent historical practice is relevant, that it only became widespread to allow it to be mailed by Election Day in more recent years, and that the predominant approach was to require receipt by Election Day throughout the historical practice you cite until very recently. How are we supposed to think about that?
I have a call at 5:30.
I mean, I think it's the same way to think about.
Okay, 14 minutes.
I think the broader history of election law is when states have kind of seen a problem, they've adapted and adjusted, and often in the direction of making sure that more votes can be counted. I mean, that was obviously a big thing when absentee voting started to become a prominent thing. Certainly we cared for much about our history of people showing up in person, but we realized that was very difficult for people away from home, and that we wanted to, kind of widen the tent and make it so that people could vote. And I think. Perhaps another realization, even though we've had UCAVA for 40 years, Justice Kavanaugh, is that for military voters in particular, this is a perennial challenge about making sure that they can actually get their ballots in on time. I mean, that's perhaps why UCAVA voters in particular are a very popular group for post-election day ballot receipt.
Would you say that the states that require receipt by Election Day are disenfranchising voters?
No, they're not, Your Honor. I mean, a reasonable ballot deadline does not do that. I would asterisk just, there are the practical barriers for those overseas military voters.
But for the citizens who are not within that class, you would not use the term disenfranchisement to say it has to be received by Election Day, November 3rd, rather than, I guess it would be 5 business days, November 10th. You would not use that term to describe that, correct?
I would not. Correct, Your Honor.
And then picking up on Justice Alito's questions, Professor Pildes and others have said that late arriving ballots open up a risk of what might destabilize the election result if the apparent winner the morning after the election ends up losing due to late arriving ballots. Charges of a rigged election could explode. The longer after Election Day any significant changes in vote totals take place, the greater the risk that the losing side will cry that the election has been stolen, end quote. And my questions, one, is that a real concern? Two, does that factor into how we think about how to resolve the scant text and the...
No. The reason I would argue this is not a real concern is because this sucks, because I don't know what they have on the record for this case, like what they've submitted to the court. Don't ever let the Trumples run with this argument. People were not accusing the 2020 election of being rigged because of the vote totals and how they came in with the mail-in ballots. They were accusing it of being rigged because Trump in advance said it would be rigged. Everybody knew that those mail-in ballots were going to heavily favor Democrats. Everybody knew it. Bernie Sanders was on some late show, and he literally laid out the exact scenario where he said, well, this could happen on Election Day. And it is what happened on Election Day. It looked like Trump had won some states, but then as the mail-in ballots were being counted, like in the following night, the following day, that it switched. Like, everybody knew that was going to happen. So the idea that some part of the election was undermined because votes were counted late or something like that, that's not true. It wasn't because they were counted late. It was because Trump said it was rigged. And he was saying that it was going to be rigged a year before the election. Okay?
Maybe conflicting or evolving history here.
I think I certainly respect the perception. I think one thing notable in this case, and I think helpful, is that
I don't like this argument because part of the defense's argument is going to be that it undermines the electoral system to see the election swap. But I don't want this image in mind or this scenario in mind for the Supreme Court justice or any American to think like, well, that is a decent argument, right? People could actually think that, there's less reliability in the electoral system because that did kind of happen in 2020, right? No, it didn't. 2020 would not be an example of that because in 2020, Trump was saying it was going to be rigged before any evidence, before any mail-in ballots were cast, before anything even came in. He probably said the same thing about 2024 anyway. He said he said the last 5 elections were all fucking rigged. So, yeah, sorry.
Do we need to see ballots as they come in city by city? Isn't this just what's the word that I would use? I don't know.
Entertainment?
It becomes less entertainment, or it becomes more entertainment and less about who actually, I don't know, kind of won. Are Americans too see mail-in votes just hit and now it looks like it's rigged to them?
I mean, for MAGA, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Unless they win, then it's not rigged.
Well, of course. It's too big to rig then.
Exactly.
There has not been much of a showing about actual fraud from post-election day ballot receipt itself. I
think Justice Alito referred to, and I think this quote refers to the appearance of fraud. And is that a real concern? Is that something we should be thinking about? Confidence in the election process? Just curious how we factor that in here.
Right, and I think it would go back to the same answer I had for Justice Alito about simple text, straightforward text, and respecting the limits of that text, and looking at the animated history. I think it was the double voting fraud concern. I don't know that people have that particular concern. I think, obviously people can be, unhappy when a result flips. I think Congress may be able to take measures to address that, but I think there's no good evidence that Congress was doing that beyond preventing double voting in this context.
If you have to have a deadline, which you acknowledged, and if having a deadline of November 3rd rather than November 10th for receipt doesn't disenfranchise anyone, why wouldn't it make more sense to take account in some respect of that concern as we think about how the text and history fit together?
Well, I think, something that Congress was clearly, trying to do was adopting a simple rule in this text. And I think a very simple rule is everybody must cast their ballot by Election Day. That's quite administrable. If you have an Election Day ballot receipt deadline, there are certainly things to commend that. I think you're alluding to some of those, Justice Kavanaugh, but there's also a question of,
I'm not talking out of time.
I'm not sure, do I need to do it at 7, whatever.
I should have killed him.
Whatever it is. Whereas, if somebody wants to get all the information possible, they like voting on Election Day, you have a pretty nice, clear, simple rule, and that seems to dovetail quite well.
Well, the simple rule, but if it arrives on November 11th, you're out.
Right, but I think that's kind of baked into the risks you always get when you're doing, there are always some risks, regrettably, with mail-in voting. You can eliminate some of those risks by voting in person, but...
The risks would seem the same, no matter whether it's November 3rd or November 10th. In other words, that it could take longer than a week for the mail to get there.
The risk is there, but I think if you have Election Day ballot, and I think what we're addressing, are more, the way I might frame the issues are, these are policy points. The question is, did Congress wall off states from debating these policy points? I think the answer is no. And I think states could very reasonably say, look, we do want to get counting and get a result very fast, but we are concerned about these military voters. We do want voters to be able to get whatever information they want. The weekend before, that used to be a big deal in elections, at least. Maybe it still could be in the future. And I think a state could say, hey, look, federal law didn't wall us off from doing this. We get that it has some things about it that other states might weigh differently, but we want to allow that for our voters.
Well, I take your point, but it really goes to just thinking about what Election Day or day of election means. But I take your point. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Justice Barrett?
So I want to be clear about what your definition of finality requires. Would it require finality if the vote arrives by Election Day as well? So let's imagine an absentee ballot that's put in the mail or sent by common carrier well in advance of Election Day and is received and put in the ballot box by Election Day. does that one have to be final? Or in other words, would it be a problem for you that the U.S. Postal Service permits recall for those ballots that are sent in advance? I guess what I'm asking is, do you have the same problem either way? You've taken a lot of questions, and I have those questions about what the effect of this recall ability is. And I guess my question is, I want to understand what your definition of finality is and whether it applies to the earlier absentee ballots as well. Do they have to be final such that it would
I'll be back, but I'm not going to be able to listen to this, so you have to tell me if anything interesting happens. Chat or mood. 1 sec.
be illegal to recall them pursuant to whatever regulation the post office has?
Right. I think I got it, Justice Barrett. Let me see if I can do my best on it. I mean, I think in theory, if Election Day has not passed, there could be a window for somebody to.
So it would be okay, it wouldn't be illegal for somebody to recall a ballot before Election Day? I guess I don't understand why.
I mean, if a state allowed that, Your Honor, we don't.
So it would be okay for the state. I know you don't allow it, but I guess I'm struggling because if your definition of the election or the vote or casting the vote requires finality, I'm trying to understand why that would be different before the election. When I'm saying before the election, I'm talking about receipt for earlier sent absentee ballots and for later sent. It seems like the same rule should apply regardless, but it seems like you're saying something different.
Yeah, I guess I'm having a hard time conceding kind of a dual track rule in that circumstance.
So would it be, let me try to put it this way, would it be illegal for a state to permit absentee voting, but permit recall, or just kind of be silent about this Postal Service regulation that permits recall, or anything a common carrier did to permit recall? Is recall a problem even if it's a possibility for those earlier absentee ballots? Because you can't consider them final. All these questions that you've been taking are about whether you could really consider the ballot to be final if you could recall it. So I'm asking whether that same finality test applies for the earlier ballots.
And I'm not sure, Your Honor. I mean, I guess I just keep coming back to you can't recall or change your vote or make.
And that's true no matter when you send it.
I think, I mean, certainly in our state, and I think that's right, Your Honor.
But I mean, as a matter of the federal law, it just seems to me that your definition has to be consistent, and it sounds like you're changing it for the earlier absentee ballots and saying finality has some kind of different force for the later received absentee ballots.
Right. Well, I think a state has to do whatever it would need to do to guarantee that on Election Day, all ballots, every cast vote is final and cannot be recalled.
But it doesn't have to be final at the time it's sent. Because it's okay to recall it if you send it 2 weeks in advance and you change your mind. That's not a problem. Okay, I'll withdraw.
Yeah, I guess I'm having trouble seeing how the Federal Election Day statute itself would necessarily.
Well, it's about your definition of election. It's about your definition of what it means to cast a vote. But let's put that aside. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about history in this case. Well, the Electoral Count Reform Act was passed in 2022, and for the first time, it defined Election Day. Should that matter? So should we be looking at how Congress understood Election Day to mean in the period of voting, what it thought in 2022, or should we be looking at the late 19th century and the Civil War practices?
I think most vitally it still remains 1845 as the key date, especially given that we have statutes that are trying to manifestly achieve uniformity in what is required of all federal offices. So I do think 1845 is the key date.
So Congress carried over in 2022 the same understanding of Election Day that had persisted throughout?
I think that's right. Final choice of an officer.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mrs. Jackson?
So let me just clarify. This case is not about a Mississippi practice or policy related to recalling ballots. Is that right?
That's right, Your Honor.
So I guess I'm a little confused about those kinds of policy questions. And I guess I think that the Constitution's allocation of responsibility here actually makes this case about who decides. I mean, there are a lot of policy questions.
I'm paying attention to
Justice Alito ran through several of them. Who gets to receive the ballot? How long after can it be submitted? Does it have to be postmarked? I suppose you can add, is recall allowed, et cetera, et cetera. But the question, I think, is whether Congress has precluded the states from making those calls, drawing those lines. And your position, as I understand it, is no.
That's correct, Your Honor.
That the scantness of Election Day in the federal statutes actually is a point in your favor because it indicates that Congress was leaving it to the states to draw the various lines that might arise in this circumstance. Is that right?
That's right, Your Honor. And that's reinforced, for example, by the 1866 statute, which shows that when Congress wanted to be really prescriptive in this area, it was very prescriptive. It described this is what the states have to do and so forth.
So if we were focused, really focused on what we're asked to answer here, which are the states preempted by federal law from having post-election day ballot deadlines, you would say no.
No, Congress just didn't decide that.
Let me ask you about the history with respect to Bruin. I guess I'm not sure I understood your answer to Justice Sotomayor because it seems to me that Bruin is not even the right methodology by which to be thinking about this. Bruin applied to
Are these
the
like
Second
the creme de la
Amendment,
creme lawyers?
Because the Second Amendment incorporated a pre-existing right. And the point of the history and tradition test was to try to evaluate the contours of that right. We don't have that dynamic here. We're trying, I thought, to figure out
Are there ever,
what
like,
Congress
retard lawyers
meant
in here?
when it included Election Day in its federal statutes. So it seems odd to me that the suggestion that the limitation on our understanding of Congress's intent is somehow tied to the state's practices.
I think that's right, Your Honor. I think the other thing, I think the point I'd emphasize is that the idea of embodying a pre-existing right confirms that there's something very much unchanging. And the thing that we know about election administration, it has very much been changing throughout the course of our country.
It's been changing throughout the course in a way that undermines the notion that there was one consistent practice, first of all, or that Congress's law, the meaning of Election Day in the federal statutes somehow was tied to what the state's practices were about that. I mean, I think this was your original point, that there were lots of different practices. And so to the extent we're saying, oh, you could only look at Election Day in the federal statute to mean exactly what the states were doing back at that time, this imperils a lot of different things, not just post-Election Day ballot deadlines, right?
That's right, Your Honor. And I mean, the only way to explain all of these changes is to read them in line with plain text and the limits of history, which is to say election is a final choice. I mean, otherwise you have to do what my friends have to do, which is, hey, look, we're going to pick out the one practice from these 19th century codes that we like, ballot receipts, say that's what an election is, and just ignore in-person voting, qualifications check on the spot by fellow voters, and that's just not sound history.
Can I ask you one final thing about the amicus brief from the Society for the Rule of Law Institute? Because I found it very interesting, and I didn't really know what your view of it was. That amicus brief focused on the Electoral College and Congress's setting it up, back in 1787, with the understanding that the casting of votes can happen on a particular day, and the receipt of those votes by election officials can happen on a different day.
More of a 1776
and in fact, the way the Electoral College is set up, I think at the time, Congress permitted in 1792 about a month to elapse between the casting of votes, which, by the way, it called Election Day, and the receipt of the votes by the electors submitted them to the President of the Senate up to a month after. So I think that's, to the extent we're worried or thinking about historical evidence, that seems to me to be pretty significant and compelling historical evidence of Congress's understanding of what was required by Election Day versus the receipt of those ballots at some subsequent point, correct?
Yeah, I think that's well stated, Your Honor. The other thing I tie it to in the same amicus brief, and I think the amicus brief does a nice job of tying into this, is the key thing is choice, choosing. The Constitution refers to choosing, choice, those kind of verbs, and that's why that sort of thing is allowed.
And the choice is made when you cast your vote under the electoral process system, when the electors cast their vote, right?
Right.
And that is distinguished. I'm just trying to make clear that the casting of the vote and the receiving of the votes historically have been conceived of as two different things that can actually happen at different times, right?
I think so, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Mr. Clement?
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, all agree that elections for federal office have to end on the day of the election specified by Congress. And all agree that you can't have an election unless you receive ballots, and there must be some deadline for ballot receipt. Nonetheless, Mississippi insists that ballots can trickle in days or even weeks after Election Day. That position is wrong as a matter of text, precedent, history, and common sense. Mississippi all but concedes that the original public meaning of election included both offering to vote and the receipt of that vote or ballot by election officials. And of course, the key distinction between voting and an election is an election involves the combined action of voters and election officials, as this court underscored in its decision against Foster against Love. And of course, Mississippi insists that at the time these statutes were passed, ballot receipt and the casting of the ballot were so inextricably intertwined, no one would have thought of one without the other. That seems to me to be a damning admission, but it also ignores the advent of field and proxy voting in the Civil War and the enormous efforts that states went to ensure that all of the ballots, whether by proxy or by field vote, were received by Election Day. In the state's view, all of those Herculean efforts were for naught or were entirely gratuitous. Now, the state's position actually works even worse as a matter of common sense. If somebody in Gulfport the day after the election asks, is the election over? The common sense answer is, no, it's not. The ballots are still coming in. And if somebody asks who won, the truthful answer is, we don't know yet. The ballots are still coming in, and they may trickle in for weeks or months. And in fact, they may trickle in for weeks or months with or without a postmark in differing ways in differing states. That reality gives the lie to the idea that we have a uniform national election day. I welcome the court's questions.
How would you define the day of election?
I would say that the day of the election is it's the last day in which all the ballots are cast and they are received into official custody.
So how would you treat early voting as compared to late reception of votes?
So I would say, I think the best place to look for a treatment of early voting is the Kreisling decision by Judge Kleinfeld in the Ninth Circuit. Because after Foster against Love, there was a suggestion in Foster against Love that maybe early voting is a problem. He rejected that claim based on two things. One is the distinct history of early voting, and the second is the idea that was explicit in this court's decision in Foster against Love that Election Day is the date of consummation. So I would say, under our theory, early voting is permissible, largely because it has a different history and because of this idea that the election day is the date where the election is consummated.
Would you spend a few more minutes on, or at least a little bit more time on the voting during Civil War? There was some suggestion that that's an example of late reception of votes. And I think in your intro, and this was my thinking, that it was not, that proxy voting was a way to make sure that the vote occurred on Election Day as opposed to afterwards.
Well, not surprisingly, Justice Thomas, you were exactly right. So proxy voting is the thing that happened in the Civil War that is most analogous to absentee voting. And the thing that is most striking is I think 5 states had proxy voting. Every one of those 5 states required the votes, the ballots, to be received by election officials back home by Election Day. Now, that's an incredibly inconvenient thing that was done in the Civil War to ensure the ballots were received by Election Day. And under the state's view, they didn't need to do that. Now, it's really no different in the context of field voting because there were like maybe a dozen states, if you're not going to count the Confederate states, there are about a dozen states that did field voting. Again, every one of those ensured that the ballots were received into official custody by Election Day. And of course, most of the states went to enormous efforts to replicate the machinery of the ballot box and everything else in the field. And some variation in that, but the one thing that didn't vary at all was that the ballots had to be received into official custody by Election Day. And just one last thought on this Civil War practice.
About the debate.
My
no,
friend's only real answer to the idea that at 1845 there was an understanding that everybody would have had that, of course, the election involves both the offer to vote and receiving the vote, the ballot, into official custody. His only answer to that is, well, like the issue hadn't ripened, that nobody had even thought that you could divide the two. But the issue ripened in the Civil War. And the issue ripened in such a way that every state required the ballot to be received into official custody by Election Day, and then that certainly informs what Congress is thinking in 1872 when they extend the presidential Election Day deadline to the congressional race.
Mr. Clement, what do I do with the 2 states during the Civil War? Rhode Island, Nevada, you say 5 favor you, at least 2 don't. Nevada simply designated 3 of the highest officers in command, didn't swear them in, just said, 3 officers in the command can create a ballot box or suitable receptacle for votes and collect the votes of the soldiers with little further formality. Those military officers then would mail those ballots in and they would be counted whether they arrived on Election Day or after. What do we do with Rhode Island that simply directed soldiers to deliver a written or printed ballot with the name of the person voted for to the officer commanding the regiment to which he belonged? That officer wasn't sworn in as a state official either, and receipt could happen thereafter. So it's not, yes, many states believed, as they did at the time, that voting had to be in person, that voting had to be it had to be by voice instead of by paper. Lots of states had lots of beliefs about what a proper election should look on. But how do we deal with the outliers? Or you just want to ignore them?
No, I don't want to ignore the outliers. I actually think Rhode Island and Nevada help me in my side of this case. And I think that's because they did designate somebody, they might not have given him an oath, but they designated somebody as an official to receive the votes. And they had to come in.
So they're here, what's the difference between the post office and a common carrier? It's the official.
No.
You want an individual person, is that it?
Well, I want somebody who's cloaked with government authority, so that's one difference. But there's a critical second difference.
But it's not state authority, meaning you're now expanding what you're saying as government authority.
So what I would say is it was government authority, and I would say that my understanding of the history is that all those federal officers voluntarily accepted the responsibility, whether they took an oath or not. And
so could a neighbor and so could anybody else. I'm not moved. The point is that it permitted someone else to deliver the item, a final cast vote, to deliver it and be received after. Under your theory of this case, and I think you and the government disagree on this, you believe that absentee voting by the military and overseas voters, the various laws, that federal laws under which states have proceeded with respect to those votes are illegal?
No,
or they're not saying what everybody has understood them to say, that states can accept absentee ballots after the election? So military and overseas ballots?
I don't think any vote is unlawful. Let me try to address how I think you would reconcile UACAVA with the Election Day statutes. And to start, I think it's important to recognize that UACAVA is not limited to the federal general election. So UACAVA applies to primary elections, to runoff elections, and special elections, and federal general elections. The Election Day statutes only apply to the general federal election. So the way I would reconcile the two is to say that all the references in UACAVA to state deadlines are perfectly fine, not preempted at all, not displaced at all, not even anomalous. With respect to the primaries, the runoffs, and the special elections. Then the court has a job to do in the federal general election as to say, like, kind of which is the specific, which is the general. I think the more logical way to do it would be to say that with the understanding in this court, if you decide in our favor, that for the federal general election, the ballots have to be in by Election Day, I would say—
Maybe we should have another president now, because wasn't it in Florida that they were counting military votes after receipt?
So with all due respect, that is the reddest of red herrings, because what happened in the 2000 election in Florida is that pursuant to a consent decree that was entered by a federal court because Florida was violating the principal provision of UACAVA, which says you have to give the absentee ballots to the overseas voters 45 days in advance. Because Florida was violating that, there had to be a consent decree to create a remedy that was not provided
What happened was that the judge made up the deadline, not the state. But I wanted to, how do you deal with the Soldier Voting Act in 1942? That permitted ballots for the extension of absentee ballots?
So the 1942 Act, at least as I understand it, again, is not addressed solely to general elections. And then with respect to general elections, it says that the military special SVA or whatever it was, the special military ballot had to come in on by the time the polls closed on Election Day. So I actually think the 1942 Act is fully supportive of our position here.
So the DOJ has been acting illegally when it has
No, Your Honor, no.
states for not following the act, the UACAVA.
No, again, remember that the UACAVA's principal protection is the provision, this is in 302 of the Act, not 303 and 304, but the 302 Act provision that says that you have to get the ballots to overseas voters 45 days in advance of the election. And interestingly, in the single most important provision in UACAVA, it ties the deadline to the date of the election.
So what do we do with Congress saying process in the manner provided by law for absentee ballots in the states involved, that's UNACAVA, and that at the time the hearings were being held on it, 12 states were identified as counting absentee ballots after Election Day. So it just ignored it and decided it was going to exempt out a little part of it, but not everything.
With respect to Sotomayor, that's why you have to remember that UACAVA is not focused only on the federal general election, which is the only thing where Congress has specified a federal deadline. So it makes perfect sense.
But does that help you or hurt you, the fact that it is broader? I mean, it's broader in the way that you describe. It applies to all of these different elections, but it doesn't make the distinction that you are making. It says with respect to all of them, state absentee ballot deadlines should apply. You're encouraging us to treat the general election differently because you interpret Election Day with respect to the general election statute to have a defined time as of Election Day. But that is not what this statute appears to be doing.
So I think it helps us, and I think it helps us because to the extent you're concerned with those references to state election deadlines, they're inevitable. If Congress is going to address anything other than the general federal election, it has to refer to the state deadlines for receiving ballots because there are no federal deadlines for any election other than the federal general election.
If that's true, Mr. Clement, you would think that Congress would say, with respect to the deadlines, that there's no separate federal requirement, X rule, and with respect to the deadlines that there is a federal requirement, Y rule. But it doesn't do anything like that. It treats them all of a piece. And we know that for many of these elections, states were setting their own deadlines, and Congress, in passing these statutes, didn't suggest any kind of distinction between those elections and these elections.
So, Justice Kagan, as with almost every statutory question that comes to this court, Congress could have made it easier. They could have done all that, and they didn't. And I think you just have to reconcile.
But so what do we take from that? I mean, it seems what they took from that is that they thought that this state function of setting ballot receipt deadlines was something that was a state function. And that's what they took from it. And so they wrote the statutes this way, where with respect to all elections, the states were setting their own receipt deadlines.
So I don't see that in the text. That doesn't seem even logical to me. I wouldn't think the one place we were going to especially defer to the states with respect to the federal general election deadline is with overseas and military voters, where the interests of the federal government are probably paramount. But I just want to be clear about this. If you read the statutes different and want to reconcile them the way that the SG does, we have no objection to that. We just think the better way to read these two statutes is to reconcile them in the way that we do. And that would have one benefit, which is don't forget that in at least 20 states, they take the election day ballot receipt deadline seriously. So if you simply say in this case that election day ballot receipt deadline is true of all 50 states, then every overseas voters, every military voter is going to be treated the same. And they'll still have 45 days to get their ballot in. And one other thing just about Mississippi in particular, Mississippi has provisions in its election code that specifically accommodate overseas military voters and overseas voters. And it's not the ballot extension deadline that we have challenged here. There's a specific provision that says for UACAVA voters and UACAVA voters only, they can email their ballots.
Paid?
So
in exposure?
The idea that anybody is going to be disenfranchised here when the overseas voters and only the overseas voters have the option of emailing in the absentee ballot that they get from Mississippi seems to me to completely be misplaced. And the concern should really be the heartland cases. And remember, as Justice Alito alluded to, you have 8 states that don't even require a postmark. And there is nothing in Mississippi's theory that turns on the existence or the non-existence of a postmark. And that's probably a good thing because the Post Service has made clear that they don't even postmark all of the mail. And postmarks have their own problems. I mean, the main mailbox, post box in post office rather in Chicago stays open 24/7. So when all the other polls close in Illinois or every other state at 8 p.m., the post office is still open till midnight. Now, I'm not here to say that there could ever be voting fraud in Chicago, but the possibility that there's a 4-hour window where people could go get their ballots, absentee ballots postmarked after all of the returns are in, and they know that, this is the election where these things could turn the result. That does not seem fair.
So can I ask you a question about the offer to vote and the vote? So historically, it seems like the offer to vote was then you had to adjudicate the voters' qualifications, and then if the qualifications were met, then the official received the vote, and then it was put into the ballot box. And as I understand it, Mississippi still has sort of a similar system because they have to adjudicate voter qualifications as well as accept the vote. So you sometimes say, you in the United States, when the ballot box closes, and you sometimes say receipt. Are those two different things, and do the voters' qualifications have to be adjudicated by Election Day as well?
I don't think they're exactly the same thing. I mean, in some sense, I think the ballot box closing is a nice kind of common sense capture for the idea that the election ends on election day. Now, I think with respect to the voter, the qualifications challenge rather, most of that is solved in the current system by registration requirements, which they didn't have historically. So we think the critical thing is there are two things that have always been absolutely indispensable in elections, and that's the casting, but also the receipt into official custody. And one thing I want to make clear about this is Mississippi still takes receipt into official custody very seriously, and it is indispensable. They just have a different deadline. They have a 5-day deadline. And we've had a lot of discussion about the possibility of recall, and I think that is a problem for Mississippi. But they have an even bigger problem in my mind, which is the November 11th problem, which is to say, as Justice Kavanaugh pointed out, if the ballot arrives 6 business days late, Mississippi doesn't count it. It's a nullity, and under the state statute, they destroy it.
But let me return you to the adjudication question, because that's really, the Mississippi local officials brief says that they do not adjudicate the qualifications of all ballots received, even by Election Day, because it takes them more time to compare the signatures and process them. And I'll just get cut to the chase. The heart of my concern is that historically, it seems like both of those things happened on Election Day, whether we're talking about Civil War, voting on the field, et cetera. But I understand that under your theory, we can separate those and say that only receipt matters, but adjudication can in fact happen afterwards. Is that correct?
I mean, that's the position we're taking in this case. I mean, I've spent enough time studying the Civil War history on ballot receipt, so I haven't studied everything about that election qualification. My sort of first cut answer standing here is that can be understood as part of the canvassing process, and that can take place after.
But I guess why can you separate out, if historically those two went hand in hand, that the qualifications, there was the offer to the vote and vote, it seems odd to say that the election is concluded by receipt when historically both of those things happened at the same time. So why is that one piece of history plucked out?
So two things. One, maybe I have another challenge that I haven't thought of. So I don't want to utterly foreclose that. But the reason I'm focused on ballot receipt is A, it's what's directly at issue here, but also B, it's the thing that to this day every state considers indispensable.
Challenge.
No state. Washington is the one that lets 21 days go by, but no state says that you don't have to have a ballot receipt deadline at all. And under Mississippi law, it's not, despite what they want to tell you, the ballot is not final when it's submitted. The ballot is final when it's received by election officials within 5 days. And you can have all the certifications that this was before Election Day and I have it notarized. And if it comes in on the 6th business day, this is the November 11th problem. What the state does is they treat it as a nullity, and under the state statute, they direct it to be destroyed. So the ballot doesn't become final just when it's submitted. The ballot becomes final when it is submitted, and under Mississippi law, it is received into official custody by the registrar within 5 business days. That's finality under Mississippi law, and our humble submission is finality should take place on Election Day.
Thank you, Counsel. Justice Thomas, anything further? Justice Alito?
We have lots of phrases that involve two words, the second of which is day. Labor Day, Memorial Day, George Washington's birthday, Independence Day, birthday, and Election Day. And they're all particular days. So if we start with that, if I have nothing more to look at than the phrase Election Day, I think this is the day in which everything is going to take place, or almost everything. And then we have 3 points in time. 1844,
God damn it, I've got so many good ideas, man.
1914.
You should be able to click someone's fucking DGG name and see a flare. Flares don't have to always show up in the chat. But imagine we could give flares out for people who go to like events, and it's not like a chat flare. It's like a
any of the three. I mean, honestly,
day.
I think the single best one, if you're just going to choose one, is 1872. And the reason I say that is because 1914 is the latest in time, but that's the one that Congress gave the least thought to, because it was right after the 17th Amendment, and they just said, yeah, whatever the rule is for the House of Representatives, we'll use that for the Senate.
Okay, so in 1872, someone sees Election Day, and maybe they start with the idea, okay, it's a particular day, and then they say, but I remember the Civil War. And a big exception was made. There were different practices in the Civil War. It wasn't everybody going to a particular polling place and voting. So what then can we take from that? Should we just take from that, well, this was an incredible national emergency where
Why are you out here protesting today? I'm just here for the DGG
What should
flare.
we take from that? What would an ordinary person have thought Election Day meant in 1872?
I just had to get my flare.
I think they would have said that's the day by which, at a bare minimum, the ballots have to be cast and received into official custody. And I think they would have, to the extent they were thinking about the Civil War history, I think the thing that would have impressed them is that even at a time of great national emergency, every one of the states insisted that the ballots be received into official custody by Election Day, whether by proxy or by field voting. Nobody said, well, it's a Civil War. Let's give them a month. Nobody said that. And people literally went into harm's way in order to do field voting, and they all did it by Election Day. That seems to me to powerfully reinforce the idea that in 1872, if you told anybody, hey, all this means is you got to cast your ballot, but the state can receive it for up to 21 days later with or without a postmark,
This
I think they would have thought
from the
that you were
morning
talking about a
stream
different
right
country.
Well, let's take the
I'm
last
sitting
of the
here
days,
listening to
1814. My understanding is that Maryland departed
politics,
from your
and my
position
co-host is just
years
AFK.
after that. Did anybody say at that time, wow, Maryland is violating the Election Day statute?
Kind of the same thing.
I don't know that they did in 1918. I don't know all the details of that. I think actually the first couple of these statutes that my friends try to count really are something different, which is they really allowed you to sort of vote in one district by Election Day and then have that election official give it to another election official. So I don't think some of those count. What I would say, though, is in 1944, Montana passed an extraordinary law that tried to extend the ballot deadlines
except I'm not getting
for
paid.
ballot receipt.
Wait,
and they
that's
did
just
it
like
in
the
World
morning
War
one,
II,
actually.
and they did it for the best of intentions. And in the Maddox case, which the parties cite in the briefs, it's this kind of extraordinary case where the Republican Party and the Democratic Party of Montana both joined forces to go to the Montana Supreme Court and said, is this law lawful? And the Montana Supreme Court said it's not lawful, it violates state law, but they also said it violates the federal law.
I pray every night for Dan to
specifying
get,
election
like, I don't know.
Thank you.
His new business redact bot for like $1 billion, and he'll give me $1 million. That's
I disagree. I mean, you can all read it for yourself. I mean, I know my friends on the other side say that. I've read the case like seven times.
In D.C., I vote by going to a ballot box that's on the city streets, all over the city streets.
That's my retirement
Is that receipt by a
fund,
state
waiting
official?
for Dan to get
I just go to
rich.
the ballot box, it's locked. I don't know and don't remember if it's time-stamped or not. But the city, I don't even know if it picks it up before Election Day. It certainly picks it up at some point. Is that legal under your theory?
I think that's compliant with the federal election.
Why? There's no state official who has received it. A ballot box has received it.
It's official state custody, and I think it's important to remember that when ballots come into official state custody, and this is true under Mississippi law as well, at that point the state treats it very seriously and establishes a chain of custody. I mean, if you want to look at in the petition appendix at Mississippi statutes, the provision
so
that
it's different. It's different for you in kinds because a military officer like Rhode Island and Nevada during the Civil War, even though they were federal officers, not sworn in the state, they were official enough? Is that it?
It was official.
An empty a ballot box with no person next to it is official enough? But the Postal Service is not.
The Postal Service is not. I don't know all the details about what Nevada and Rhode Island did. I'm actually not even sure the Nevada statute was ever implicated because Nevada didn't become a state until the Civil War was basically over. But in all events, I think the statute that's issued here is worth reading. If you look at 89A of the petition appendix, I mean, they go to Mississippi once it's in the ballot box. and this is true of the absentee ballots that are received within 5 days, they go into lockdown. The registrar is told to record the number of ballots in the box at the end of every day. They are specifically treated essentially as to have a chain of custody to ensure that if somebody alleges there was monkey business in this election, they have a clear record of chain of custody that can show no, there was not. There's nothing like that when you drop it in the mailbox. There's nothing like that when you use FedEx. And I don't know, they say it's illegal to recall your ballot, but the post office allows you to do that. The FedEx allows you to do that. As Justice Gorsuch indicated, I don't think there's any way the state would even know it happened.
We have a state government official lawyer telling us on behalf of the state how to read their laws. Where are we on an issue that was forfeited below and not raised below are going to assume to the contrary now?
It was raised below. This was raised in the reply brief in the Court of Appeals. When my friend referred to it not being raised till the reply brief, I assume he was referring to in the Fifth Circuit. But it's in the Fifth Circuit decision, so it's properly before this court.
Justice Kagan?
Mr. Clement, I'm wondering what you make of the 2022 amendment, because that pretty clearly suggests that voting can take place not just on a day, but in a period. And what are we to make of the fact that Congress, just a few years ago, said there's a period of voting, and we're fine with that?
So to me, the most sort of striking thing, if we're talking about the same statute, the Electoral Count Reform Act, ECRA, or whatever it is, to me the most striking thing is there's one change to the Federal Election Day statute in particular, and it creates a possible exception for force majeure events. And I would view that as the only exception that Congress created.
Yeah, but the exception for force majeure events assumes a baseline of a period of voting. It talks about a state modifying the period of voting, those special events. But the baseline is that the state has a period of voting, which it then modifies for force majeure events. So I think that this is not like some special exception. It's an exception in the statute that assumes that a state is going to have not a day of voting, but very likely a period of voting.
So I would think that the most the period of voting would refer to is the practice of early voting, which we're not taking issue with here. And as I said, that has a distinct history. But I don't think they were saying the period of voting could last until after the election, because if that's what they had in mind, there would be no reason to create an exception for force majeure events. That'd just be part of the period.
And could you tell me, going back to this, we're not taking issue with early voting, how it is that you're not taking issue with early voting? Because every time I sort of try to state what your rule is, it seems to me it's a rule that prevents early voting, because you're basically saying there are two things that have to happen, and they have to happen on Election Day. And it's the voting and, the casting of the vote and the receipt of the vote, and both of those things have to be on Election Day. And just like a normal person says, okay, well, when I early vote, I'm not doing that on that first Tuesday.
So I get why an ordinary person would think that, and for what it's worth, like a couple of ordinary people read your Foster against Love decision and thought, whoa, this gets rid of early voting. And they brought challenges in the Ninth Circuit, and they brought challenges in the Sixth Circuit, and all those challenges were rejected. They did it right in the wake of...
Let me suggest to you that they were rejected because it just seems inconceivable that on the basis of this kind of evidence, we would reject these practices that are so entrenched in 30 states. But the problem still remains is that your theory would have us reject them.
No, I don't think it would. And I mean, it's my theory, so I'll tell you what it is. These things have to be consummated by Election Day. I'm not making that word up. It's not the word I would make up if I were making up words. But it's the word that this court used in Foster against Love.
So that's where the theory comes from? It comes from the word that this court used in Foster?
Yes, and that was a word.
Don't look so, because a word that we used in Foster is the premise for your being able to separate Mississippi's law from every early voting law in the world, even though your basic theory should say that the early voting laws are also verboten?
No, with respect. I mean, I said two things when I first answered this question. The differential history. And I think it's worth reading Judge Kleinfeld's opinion on this. It's a Kiesling case in the Ninth Circuit, because he goes through this in quite some detail, and he admits there's actually a pretty good argument based on the text and Foster that early voting is problematic. But he nonetheless, even though he thinks it's a pretty good argument, comes to the conclusion, not because he thought it was crazy, but because the history is different, which was marshaled in that case in particular, and Foster talks about everything needing to be consummated by Election Day. And I don't think it was just a random word. It's trying to explain the unanimous decision in Foster against Love, which says, there was voting and there was receipt of ballots, and the problem was it all happened a month too early.
Thank you.
Justice Gorsuch?
On early voting, I just want to see
Wait, is it really in
right.
3?
Both sides agree that there needs to be a final decision by the voter and receipt by Election Day.
Do you think he'll let me come in there and hang with Josiah?
I don't think so. I don't think they agree with receipt by Election Day.
Receipt by somebody.
Oh, dear leader.
I'm going to do that.
The reason I trip up on that,
I know, but
okay, sorry.
I'm just trying to make sure there needs to be some final decision by the voter and receipt by somebody by Election Day. On that, I think you two agree. I think the disagreement is receipt by whom. And for you, it's an election official. And for your friend on the other side, it could be my neighbor. Is that a fair summary of your views? Because it seems to me you both agree that the final decision needs to be made.
I'm gonna get Wick to invite me to Steve's next debate. I'm gonna be on Steve's side, and I'm just gonna merely play the soundboard. Cinema.
Based.
You didn't miss anything. It was boring.
Wait, is the defense going yet?
It was still the Republicans.
Jesus.
That was the last time I was tuned in.